The litter came in crooked under the rotor wash, with two deck hands half running over packed sand while the bird hammered the shoreline flat. I smelled salt spray, dust, old fuel, and hot metal, and it all hit the back of my throat at once. The man on the canvas was wrapped badly, strapped too tight across the chest and too loose at the hips, the kind of rush job people made when they wanted urgency more than accuracy. I stepped in before they reached the skid, caught the rail with one hand, and put the other into the wound before I looked at his face. I checked with my hands first, sensing heat, texture, and pressure before finding the lie. The flesh at his side was torn in a severe injury, something you could call an industrial accident if you needed the paperwork to stay simple. But the blood was wrong. It was too dark where it should have been slick, and too dry at the edges. It dragged under my glove instead of stringing. Beside me, Jack stopped so hard the leash snapped against my wrist. He didn't lean toward the blood. His shoulders dropped, his spine went stiff, and his head turned toward a black equipment bag tied low against the litter frame. Don't put him on the bird. Nobody heard me the first time, or they heard me and filed it under not now. The nearest crew chief kept moving, one hand up against his headset, while the other shoved the litter forward. I planted my forearm across the rail and shoved back, pushing hard enough that the frame barked against the bracket, and one of the handlers cursed at me. The man on the litter groaned on cue, just enough to sound useful, but I ignored him. My thumb pressed along the wound margin. Bruising had already set under the torn skin in a pattern that belonged to force, not fresh panic. There should have been more live seep if he had taken that hit when they said he did, more mess on the canvas, and more on the hands carrying him. Instead, there was just enough blood to make decent people hurry. Jax gave one short blast of breath through his nose and leaned away from the body, showing not fear, but absolute refusal. He strained toward the bag again, his line tight as wire. I finally looked where he was looking. I looked at the black nylon, noting the sea grit in the zipper teeth and a fresh scrape on one corner. It was the wrong place for personal effects, the wrong way to secure it, and wrong in every possible way. "Move, ma'am." His tone was sharp, flat, and procedural. People always think procedure is neutral until it decides they're in the way. I kept one hand on the litter and lifted two fingers toward the nearest medic to signal a hold. He waits. The carrier nearest me stared, like I had said, let him die, which was fair enough. We had a launch window closing, a patient who looked bad from 10 feet out, and a helicopter turning money and fuel into noise. But the scene smelled staged. There was blood, yes, but also burned hydraulic fluid. Somewhere farther back, salt mud and wet rope. And under that, there was a hard synthetic tang that had Jax locked in like a vice. It was not coming from the casualty, but from the bag. Jax edged closer by half an inch, then stopped himself, his claws cutting lines into the sand. He never barked when he was working, because people who wanted dogs to bark liked movies more than they liked dogs. I slid my hand from the wound to the man's wrist and found his pulse present and fast, a little too cooperative. He cracked one eye, then let it sag shut when he saw me watching. Most hurt men look for help, but this one checked whether the act was landing. The whole pad shifted tone when the pilot throttled down a fraction and the wash changed pitch. You learn to hear that if you stay around birds long enough. It bought us seconds, and I used them. I hooked 2 fingers through Jax's harness, ran the quick 3-tap check along the chest strap, and felt him settle into the contact while the line still trembled with warning. Then, boots hit metal behind me, sounding heavier and deliberate. It was someone coming in from the aircraft, not the ground team. I didn't turn yet. I kept looking at the bag, at the sand under the litter, and at the missing smear a real panic load leaves behind. It was too neat where it mattered, and too messy where it sold the story. Behind me, a man's voice cut through the engine chop before he got close. Who stopped my load? I looked up and saw a tall man with flight gear zipped to the throat, holding a checklist booklet clipped in one hand like it had grown there. It was Caleb Hayes, the aircrew lead, the kind of man who believed procedures existed because chaos had already had its turn. He took in the blocked litter, my bloody glove, the dog fixed on the bag, and the seconds bleeding off his launch window. The patient made another sound. Hayes stepped down into the wash, his eyes on me now, and held out the booklet like a warrant. Caleb didn't bother ducking the wash. He came through it squared up, one hand clamped on the checklist booklet, the other keeping his headset tight against one ear while the blades shredded every loose thing on the pad. "You just scrubbed my launch over a field call?" he shouted, showing not rage, but controlled disbelief. Behind him, the bird rocked on its gear, impatient as an animal held on a short chain. Off to my left, Dr. Miller spat grit and said what half the pad was already thinking. "Looks like a sloppy carry and a bad handoff, that's all." The casualty on the litter gave another pained little moan, still bleeding enough to keep the clock honest, but still not bleeding right. I wiped 2 fingers down my glove, pointed at the rail, then at the ground under it. Nobody touches him. Nobody moves that bag. Caleb's eyes tracked where I pointed, then came back to me like I was wasting his oxygen. It was a fair reaction. From where he stood, he had a compromised patient, a blocked aircraft, and a medic stepping on the throat of procedure with one bloody hand. The litter straps buzzed in the downwash, and canvas slapped metal in little nervous bursts. Somewhere inside all that noise, the fake casualty kept breathing, like a man trying to remember how injured he was supposed to be. I dropped to a knee before anybody could turn it into an argument and pressed my palm flat against the sand. Rotor wash hit my sleeve hard enough to make the fabric snap against my wrist. The top layer of dust had skated off in one clean bias, not scattered, not stomped, but forcefully driven. It was the same thing on the dragged scrape beside the litter track. It should have run straight with the reported fall, but it didn't. It had been pushed and feathered off at the same angle as the wash rolling under the bird right now. Gear marks near the casualty's boots told the same story. They were too clean on one side and overworked on the other, like somebody had dressed the mess after the fact and counted on noise and urgency to do the rest. I looked up at Caleb. This skid mark isn't from a fall. It was flattened by our own rotor wash. He stared at the ground, not at me, which was a good sign. People who keep staring at you are still fighting. But people who look down are finally thinking. I dug one fingertip into the packed surface and felt the top skin of grit shear away from the firmer layer underneath, revealing something fresh, mechanical, and recent. Dr. Miller moved in 2 steps, hunched against the wash, and squinted where I had opened the scene for him. "Could still be slop," he said. "Wet sand, bad boots, men in a hurry." I nodded once. "Then tell me why the drag mark shifts before the carrier track deepens." He didn't answer right away, and he didn't need to. Sloane came off the edge of the pad with Jax's spare line wrapped around one fist. Her eyes narrowed against the dust. She saw the same offset and stopped talking altogether. Caleb crouched, pressed the booklet against his leg to hold the pages still, and sighted along the scrape like he was lining up a shot. The patient let out another ragged sound. One of the deck hands shifted his weight toward the helicopter. Jax snapped the line tight again, his shoulders low, and his muzzle still locked on the bag. The dog had been right about one thing already, maybe 2. Caleb looked from the ground to the litter to the aircraft, doing the ugly math every lead has to do when the safe option starts smelling rehearsed. The wash changed again as the pilot asked for status over the net. Caleb didn't answer at first. That silence rang louder than the engines. He stood, wiped grit off his mouth with the back of his glove, and looked past me toward the route they had filed for departure. The clean one, the expected one, the one any half-competent watcher would already have on a board somewhere. I could see the thought land even before he said it. It was too predictable, too easy, and put too much trust in a story that had already failed first contact. "If you're wrong," he said, his voice lower now, forced through his teeth instead of over the rotor, "I lose a patient and a bird for nothing." I nodded. If I'm right, you lose more than that by lifting. He held my eyes for one beat, then turned his head just enough to bark toward the aircraft. Stand by. Nobody loads. The crew chief froze. Dr. Miller looked back at the altered scrape. Sloane followed Jax's line to the black bag and didn't like what she found there in her own head. Caleb tapped the checklist against his thigh once, hard, then pointed toward the darker edge of the pad, where the ground kit had been staged. Show me what else they lied about. Kira took the bag off the litter herself. She did it not because nobody else could, but because weight told the truth faster than labels ever did. Sloane came in on her right, one gloved hand already out, her eyes narrowed against the wash rolling off the idling helicopter. The false casualty kept making those low hurt noises from the canvas, thin and careful, like he knew pain had to stay audible if the story was going to hold. Jax ignored him completely. The dog stood with his shoulders dropped and every line of his body stretched toward the dark marsh beyond the pad, the leash humming in Kira's fist. Then a tight sound slipped out of his throat. Not a bark, never that, but more like a warning he had decided belonged only to her. Kira set the bag on an overturned fuel crate, found the zipper, and paused long enough to run the 3-tap check down the front of Jax's harness. He answered with one deep breath and a fresh pull toward the reeds, signaling he was ready. So was she. Or close enough for this kind of night. Sloane peeled one side of the nylon back, while Kira held the bag steady. There were no blinking lights, no obvious brick with wires hanging out, and nothing theatrical. There was just a dense cluster of parts nested in cut foam, salt damp around the seams, clean where they should have been dirty, and smudged where they should have been clean. She saw a gold-plated logic board and a cold metal cylinder housing deep-set optical lenses. That was the first problem. The second was the smell. It was cold, metal, wet plastic, and a bitter edge that had no business riding under a medevac bird with a bleeding man. Jax leaned in, inhaled once, then recoiled half a step and turned his muzzle toward the marsh. It was not fear, but direction. Kira studied the pieces, noting the way they had been packed for transport instead of use, and the way the bag had been strapped low against the litter rail where nobody rushing a hot load would stop to question it. Caleb came close enough to hear over the engine noise. Kira pointed with 2 fingers. It belongs to who, not what. He frowned at that, then at the open bag. Talk to me. It isn't personal gear, she said. It's moving under cover of a casualty. Dr. Miller leaned in, then straightened with that tired, offended look old medics got when the world found a fresh way to be stupid. Decoy? He asked. Bait, Kira said. Maybe marker, maybe cue, doesn't matter. It needed a flight path and a moral shield. The man on the litter groaned again. Caleb looked at him, then at the bag, his posture changing in a way only another professional would notice. He was less certain and less married to the first answer. Sloane bent, checked one foam cavity, then shook her head once. Jax pulled harder toward the marsh, his claws scratching over packed shell grit at the edge of the landing zone. He pulled not toward the body and not toward the aircraft, but out there, where the ground turned black and flat and mean. Kira crouched beside him and laid her palm against the front strap of his harness while she worked through the geometry. If they had loaded the bag and launched on the original route, the aircraft would have lifted exactly where any observer expected, turned exactly how the route card said it would, and carried this thing through the cleanest line on the map. It was clean and predictable, the kind of route somebody could build a kill box around in advance. Caleb folded the checklist booklet shut. Even under the rotor noise, that sound carried with finality. Pilot stays on the ground, he said into the mic. We are not flying this route. He gave no speech and showed no visible conversion. It was just a hard decision made the second the math turned ugly enough to own. The crew chief swore from the skid. Somebody on the net asked for confirmation, and Caleb gave it. Kira watched the disappointment move through the crew. That brief, sick pause, when the machine option disappeared and the wet, dark terrain around them turned personal. Sloane repacked the bag without touching more than she had to. Dr. Miller checked the casualty again, not because he believed the act, but because a man could still bleed while lying about why. Jax fixed on the marsh line so hard the muscles in his neck stood out under the fur. Kira followed his gaze and finally saw it the way he had been trying to hand it to her from the beginning. I saw not a point, but a corridor, a strip of black water and low reeds, where the night stayed thicker than it should have. A place built for movement nobody wanted logged. Caleb looked at the dark, then back at her. "You got another way?" Kira nodded once. "Not a good one." He jerked his chin toward the shoreline. "Grab what you can carry. We walk." They left the helicopter behind like a choice nobody wanted to say out loud. Once the rotor noise fell off behind them, the coast got louder in all the wrong ways. Water sucked at mud, wind worried through dead reeds, and boots scraped shell and stone. Some loose clip on somebody's loadout kept tapping metal in a rhythm, just crooked enough to work on the nerves. Caleb stretched the team into a narrow file along the base of a bluff, where rock leaned over the path on one side, and the sea kept gnawing at the ground on the other. We used no white light, just an occasional hooded red beam when the footing turned bad enough to break an ankle. Jax moved ahead of Kira's knee on a short line, not pulling, just tuned so tight she felt each change in him through the leash before she saw it. The harness still held from the quick check at the pad, but the carabiner wore a fresh scrape she did not like. There was no time to hate it properly. The bag rode under a dark cover on Caleb now, ugly and compact and quiet. Nobody spoke unless it mattered, which helped, because words had a way of making fear sound bigger than it was. They were halfway through the narrowest part of the trail when the first round came in. It cut past Kira's left ear with a dry, tearing hiss and smashed into the bluff hard enough to throw grit across her cheek. Everybody went down at once. There was no style to it, just bodies choosing dirt over air. Caleb hit a knee and dragged the covered bag behind a broken concrete stub. Sloane flattened beside a shelf of stone, one hand over the back of her neck. Jax dropped so fast the leash burned through Kira's glove. Then the second burst came, not centered on the file and not walking straight through the bodies, but chewing the edges of the path in fast, ugly bites. Concrete chipped and stone broke as a shell fragment struck Kira's face, leaving a warm trace toward her jaw. She crawled the last foot to cover and looked where the impacts were landing instead of where fear wanted her to look. I looked not at people, but at corners, surfaces, and the spots any decent human under fire would choose without thinking. "Stay off the right side," she said. "Move left if you move." Caleb glanced over. "You got flash?" "No." Another impact showered sparks off the wall above them. "I've got intent." It sounded smarter than it felt. In the moment, it was only pattern, old damage, and the part of her brain that refused to die just because the rest of her wanted to flinch. The rounds were not chasing center mass. They were shaving the concrete lip and bluff face in a tight slant, building pressure instead of stacking bodies. Kira leaned out far enough to catch the new impact scars on the ruined wall ahead. Fresh marks ran in a diagonal line, each strike close enough to the next to herd rather than harass. She had seen that before. It was fire used like a hand between the shoulder blades, demanding you turn here, step back, pick the wrong cover, and finish the job yourself. "He's not trying to hit you first," she said, more to Caleb than anybody else. One of the others breathed. "What?" Kira pointed low. "He's cutting the corner. He wants us in the trough." Ahead, the trail widened into a darker patch that looked like usable cover. It was too open on first glance and too inviting on second. If they ran there, they would get pinned against soft sand and dead rock with nowhere to break line. She started counting the pause between bursts. 1, 2, 3. It was the same rhythm, It was close enough that she trusted it, which was where the knight reached up and charged interest. Next pause. 2 at a time, she said. Caleb did not argue, which made it worse. He trusted the reed because the reed was good. It was the clock behind it that failed. The burst cut off. Kira hit the count and shoved Sloane first, Jax moving with her, Kira right behind. The leash went brutally tight. Jax slammed into the turn, his mass dragging my arm hard enough to strain the shoulder joint, his claws skittering wildly on wet concrete. Caleb hauled the bag after him and hit the wall hard enough to grunt. Another burst ripped across the opening they had abandoned, sealing it off behind them. Inside the corridor, the dark changed quality. It offered less open night and more trapped damp, rust, salt, and mold. Water ticked deeper in, and their breathing sounded too loud. Outside, another round slapped the entrance. No one fired back because there was nothing to shoot at. Whoever was out there did not need a clean kill yet. They only needed the team deeper, tighter, and blinder. Kira wiped grit and blood from her mouth and listened to the corridor breathe around them. She had read the geometry right, but she had read the timing wrong. Out there, still invisible, Julian Cross was steering. The corridor narrowed fast after the turn, with concrete sweating salt, rust flaking off old brackets, and the air thick enough to chew. I could still hear rounds smacking the entrance behind us, flat and ugly. But inside, that cut, the real problem changed shape. There was no room, no swing, and no clean way to set a line or build a defense. The med bag kept dragging my left shoulder down like somebody was hanging off me, and every step made the strap bite deeper into the muscle already lit up from the last scramble. Jax stayed close to my knee, breathing hard through his nose, the leash short, and the harness pulling a little wrong after that turn. Caleb had the covered bag tucked behind him and was trying to find an angle on the entrance without presenting half his face to it. Sloane was bent low, her hand on the wall, listening more than looking. We all heard the same thing then. It wasn't gunfire, but boots. They were fast, controlled, coming through the mouth of the corridor right behind the fading echo of the last burst. That was the point where the night stopped being geometry and turned into a physical struggle. I shifted my weight, felt the rough wall against my shoulder blade, and realized I didn't have enough room to do anything pretty. Good. Pretty gets people killed. The first man hit the dark at a run and checked himself only when he realized how tight the corridor really was. He came in low, weapon up, trying to own space with speed before we could reset. Caleb slammed into him shoulder first, driving both of them into the wall hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. The second man came in right behind, smart enough not to bunch up, and smarter still to use the first collision as cover. I went for him, and the med bag nearly pulled me sideways. My boot slid on damp concrete. My left shoulder clipped the wall, but my right hand came up anyway and caught cloth, webbing, bone, and something solid under all of it. It was no textbook move, just grip and force and the animal need to stop him getting past me toward Jax or the radio on my chest. He drove forward like he knew exactly how little room I had. My spine hit rough concrete, and air left me in a heavy gasp. Then Jax launched. It was not wild, and not pet rage, but pure work. He hit low and hard, taking the man off his base just long enough for me to jam an elbow into his throat and turn his weight into the wall. Metal clanged in the corridor, boots scraped, and somebody's forearm crushed across my collarbone. Everything smelled like old rust, wet grit, and breath torn out under pressure. It lasted seconds, but felt longer. That's always the trick. Time stretches when your body is busy trying not to lose pieces. The man on me recovered faster than I wanted. He got one hand on my vest, another on the strap of the med bag, and yanked. The whole load twisted, wrenching my left side down so hard I saw white for a beat. At the same instant, Jack surged again, and the leash snapped tight across my right wrist. The carabiner bit into bone and skin, hot and sharp, then jammed against a buckle on my kit. I felt the line twist, and felt the harness torque sideways on him. bad. Very bad. But I had no time to fix it. I slammed the back of my head into the wall, not to stun myself, just to buy a half-inch of space. I took it and drove my knee up ugly and close. The man folded enough for me to shove him off balance. Jax dragged at his lower arm and turned him just enough that he crashed into the first body Caleb was still fighting. Sloane came in from my blind side and cracked something metal into somebody's forearm. A weapon clattered, spun, and disappeared under boots. No one spoke, because there wasn't room for words. There was just breath, impact, cloth tearing, and the low, furious sound Jax made when he had purchase, and was waiting for the fight to decide whether it was over yet. Then it was over, the way these things usually are. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't heroic. It was just suddenly one body too hurt to keep coming and the other smart enough to drag him back toward the entrance before he got trapped inside with us. Caleb kicked the loose weapon farther into the dark and braced himself at the mouth of the corridor, his chest heaving, listening for another rush that didn't come. Sloane spat blood onto the floor and pressed herself flat to the wall again. I stayed where I was for 1 second too long because my right wrist was on fire. The leash had wound once around the edge of my gear, and the carabiner at Jax's chest was twisted hard. The metal scored and bent, with one side of the gate not sitting flush anymore. Jax stood close, still ready, but his harness rode a little crooked now. I could see where the strap had taken the strain, and see where the next hard pull might turn damage into failure. My med bag had ripped at one seam, and a roll of gauze was hanging halfway out like a white tongue. Outside, the shooters had gone quiet again. Too quiet. I unwound the line from my wrist, checked Jax with one fast touch, and felt the fault still there under my fingers. It was not a break, but maybe something worse. A weakness. It was the kind that waits until later, when you need it most, and then chooses for you. We came out of that concrete throat soaked in sweat and grit, and the kind of silence that only shows up after close contact. Nobody wanted to waste oxygen on a recap. The marsh took us in one careful step at a time, with mud sucking at our boots, reeds brushing our sleeves, and frogs clicking somewhere out in the black water like tiny broken switches. My wrist throbbed where the leash hardware had chewed into it, and every few steps I felt the damaged carabiner at Jax's chest knock softly against his harness ring. It was the wrong rhythm and the wrong sound. Caleb had his GPS up under a shielded red beam, his face blank in that way disciplined men get when they're forcing themselves back inside procedure, because procedure at least pretends not to bleed. The path split ahead, around a low run of standing water and a concrete culvert half swallowed by cattails. The left branch looked cleaner, offered firmer ground, and a better exit line on the map. The right branch disappeared into darker brush, where the mud went black and glossy. Jax stopped dead before the fork, and every muscle along his back cinched tight. It was not alert and not confusion, but refusal. He leaned away from the cleaner path and fixed on the darker one, like something over there had reached out and taken hold of him by the nose. Route A, Caleb said, low and clipped, holding the GPS where all of us could see the line. That's the only clean track that gets us to high ground before dawn. Jax did not even look at the screen. He braced harder, claws spreading in the mud, his head angled toward the right branch. The leash drew straight and humming between us, and I felt the strain through the torn skin at my wrist. Sloane watched the dog first, then me. Smart woman. Caleb took one step toward the left path, and Jax gave a short blast of breath and planted harder. Shoulders dropped, his body refusing the command before I had even voiced it. He's contaminated on that line, I said. Caleb's jaw tightened, or he smoked from the fight and reading cross-scent. He was not wrong to push, which was the problem. He was doing exactly what a lead was supposed to do, when time, distance, and fatigue started making people mystical. We're burning minutes, he said. I'm not gambling the whole team on canine preference. I crouched, not to soothe Jax, but to read him. The refusal was too clean, showing no panic, no scatter, and no indecision. He was rejecting one corridor and waiting the other. That was different, and that mattered. I looked at the left branch again. It was too neat and too available. It carried the same smell the bird had worn back at the pad, suggesting somebody else's idea of safe. The GPS says it's clear, but my dog says it smells like C4 and burnt plastic. I'm going with the dog. Caleb gave me a look that would have cut weaker material. That is not evidence. Then give me 10 seconds and I'll find you some. I slipped the flashlight out and hooded it low, sweeping the beam along the edge of the left branch, where the mud should have held only tidal wash and boot drag. The first thing I found was wrong because of shape. A patch of black mud had been pressed flat and dense in a clean-edged angle no natural step made. I knelt and pushed my thumb into it. The top crust broke with a dry crack, and the packed layer under it held together for half a beat before smearing. It was mechanical compression, not random foot traffic, and not marsh settling. Someone had weighted that spot and lifted clean. "Here," I said. Caleb came down beside me despite himself. I rubbed the mud between finger and thumb, then wiped it on the concrete lip of the culvert. Too sharp on the break, something hard sat here. He still looked unconvinced, but now he was unconvinced in the useful way. He was thinking, not dismissing. I widened the beam another foot and caught a pale edge tangled between roots near the waterline. It was not shell and not reed. I reached in and pulled free a shard of gray composite, thin, rigid, and man-made, the kind of material that had no business growing out of a swamp root. Caleb took the fragment from me and turned it under the red light. Even in that color, the surface looked wrong against everything around it. It was too engineered and too deliberate. Sloane glanced from the shard to the compressed mud, then to Jack's, still locked on the darker route, and gave the smallest nod in the world. There was no sentiment in it, just math. Caleb lowered the GPS and stared down the clean branch one more time, maybe hoping it would defend itself. It didn't. The marsh just breathed and waited. Finally, he thumbed the screen dark, and that little click carried farther than it should have. "Route B," he said. There was no apology and no ceremony, just a decision pulled out of evidence with pliers. Relief did not come with it, only direction. I adjusted my grip on the leash and ran one quick touch over Jax's harness where the damaged hardware sat. He gave one deep breath and shifted his weight forward, tension changing from refusal to commitment. We turned into the darker branch, mud taking our boots to the ankle, brush closing in tight enough to scrape our sleeves. Behind us, the cleaner route stayed open and waiting, neat as a lie on a clipboard. Ahead, there was only black water, the smell of burned plastic hanging thin under the swamp rot, and the ugly comfort of knowing the dog had not asked me to trust him. He had forced me to prove him right. Route B narrowed into ruin without ever admitting it had become one. The reeds gave way to broken concrete pads tilted in the mud, leftovers from some dead coastal utility site half-eaten by salt and neglect. Wind moved through rusted rebar with a thin singing sound that got under the skin. Ozone sat in the air with swamp rot and old standing water. Kira kept Jax close on the short line. The damaged hardware at his chest gave that wrong little click every few steps, and each time she heard it, her jaw tightened another notch. Nobody talked. Caleb moved a few yards ahead, with the covered bag slung low. His shoulders set like he could force the dark to follow orders if he kept walking. Sloane drifted off his right shoulder, scanning the collapsed structures ahead. Then a shape appeared in the path, pale against the mud. One arm flung wide, one leg twisted under the body at an angle ugly enough to look honest. It was a man. Maybe. He lay half on concrete, half in black water, just far enough into the open that any medic would feel the hook sink. Caleb saw him and stopped. Sloane froze behind him. Jax did not surge forward. He stiffened, his nose working in short, hard pulls, his head low, Not dismissing the body, but not buying it either. That was enough to slow the part of Kira that had already begun its ugly math. I calculated airway, bleed, access, and time. The man let out a wet little sound over the wind, human enough to hurt. Kira took one step before she caught herself. The motion pulled an older one up behind it, not a full memory. Nothing cinematic, just the shape of another night and another body in the dirt, and the fatal half-second where she had chosen the wounded one in front of her over the men still breathing behind her. She did not see faces, and she did not hear speeches from the dead. She only felt the structure of that mistake come back whole, recognizing the immediate casualty and the second-order harm. Caleb glanced over. "You've got him?" It was a simple question, but brutal in its timing. Kira did not answer. It was not because she did not know, but because she knew too fast, and the part of her that wanted to move could not be trusted yet. She dropped into a crouch and studied the body without closing the distance. The man's chest rose, but not right. It was too regular under too much distress. One hand lay palm up, finger slack, clean in a way the rest of him was not. Mud covered the sleeve, but not the hand. His boot heel rested in a seam between broken slabs, where the dark packed deeper than it should have. Kira let her eyes move outward from the body. Surroundings first, then access, then cost. It was the old rule, the good one, when she actually obeyed it. She followed the line of concrete and found a disturbed patch near the torso. Not dramatic, just wrong enough to matter. It was too neat and too symmetrical. There were no panic marks around him, no blind crawl, no dragged heel, and no smear from a man trying to get off the mark. There was just placement. It was a body-shaped sentence laid in the path for decent people to finish. The man made another small sound. Caleb shifted, ready to move in spite of himself. Kira lifted one hand without looking back, to signal a hard stop. Her pulse beat at the edges of her vision, but her mind had gone cold in the useful way. If she went in without clearing the ground, she risked the team. If he was real and she left him, she would carry that too. There was no clean option, which was the trap. I can't save him. Not tonight. The thought landed like metal and everything around it locked into place. Bait did not have to explode to work. It only had to stall, bunch bodies, and pull eyes off the angles that mattered. Kira rose and moved left instead of forward, keeping the line short on Jax, watching the slab seams, weeds, and dead space under the platform. "We go around," she said. Caleb's face tightened. "You sure?" Sure enough. She gave no speech and no confession about ghosts, dressed like casualties. Sloane read her tone, then the ground, and gave a small, sharp nod. Jax moved with them at once, tension changing from question to commitment. As they edged wide through ankle-deep black water, the body let out one last weak sound behind them, almost offended at being ignored. Kira did not look back. Looking back was how the trap kept its teeth in you. Wind hit the sweat on her neck and turned it cold. Ahead, the path narrowed toward the coast. Behind them, the decoy stayed where it was, patient as guilt. She had chosen the team over the body this time. It was the correct call, the adult call. It still felt like swallowing broken glass. Beneath their boots, the sucking mud of the marsh finally began to give way, yielding to crushed shells and hard, unforgiving rock as the path squeezed them toward the shoreline. The coastline pinched down until land, water, and concrete all fought for the same narrow strip. There was a broken seawall on one side and black surf on the other. Wind drove a fine, wet mist across everything, enough to slick every surface and turn the air metallic with salt and rust. Kira moved with Jax close at her knee. Feeling the damaged hardware on his harness knocked the line at the wrong angle every few steps. It was the wrong sound and the wrong tension, a bad promise, waiting for the right moment to collect. Caleb stacked the team along the inside edge of the wall, while Sloane checked the choke point ahead, where collapsed concrete spilled into the flats. Nobody talked much, as they had all learned by now that the environment was never background out here. It was an accomplice. Jax surged once toward the opening, still working through the damage, because work was what he knew. Then the harness shifted. It was not much, just enough. The Twisted Carabiner rode, slipped, and dragged him half a step off clean footing. His front paw came down on something hidden under shell, grit, and storm trash. There was a metallic scrape, a cut-off yelp, and he went down hard. Blood spilled onto the concrete in a sudden rush. Kira was on him before the others finished turning. Jax tried to rise once, failed, and folded onto his side with a ragged, choking breath that hit her like a fist. There was no panic. She assessed airway, bleed, and position. She dropped to both knees, got a hand under him, and found heat, slick fur, and muscle shuddering under the skin. The wound was deep and pumping fast enough to make the next decision for her. Hold still, Jax. You don't get to die here. Her voice came out flat. Good. Flat was useful. Caleb moved over her shoulder and turned outward, weapon up, covering the seawall and the flats beyond. Sloane hit the deck beside them and shoved the med pouch into Kira's hand. Kira tore it open with wet fingers, found gauze by touch, and drove pressure into the wound with the kind of force softer people always mistook for cruelty. Jax's breathing turned into a harsh struggle. His body jerked once under her forearm. She leaned harder, using all of herself because half measures were for peacetime. Blood warmed the inside of her glove, and mist ran down the back of her neck. Above them, a round snapped over the wall and vanished into black water. Then another. They were not aimed at her exactly. Not yet. It was search, fire, containment, and pressure. She stayed low because the posture was keeping him alive, and because from down there, the geometry changed. Human height had shown her a broken wall and a tidal choke point, but ground level showed her the machinery under it. Through the gaps in shattered concrete, she could see farther across the flats than anyone standing should have. Shapes moved in the dark water, low and deliberate, proving it was not wave action and not debris. It was men, 2, maybe 3. They were using the tide line and the blind angle behind the seawall to move something long and sealed on a low carrier, keeping it below the silhouette of the broken structures. It was not random cargo, because they were too careful and too coordinated. One of them paused over the load with the practiced economy of a man protecting function, not loot. Caleb saw where Kira was looking and dropped lower. What do you have? Kira did not ease pressure off Jax when she answered. There. Title line. They're moving the real package. Another round skipped, sparks off concrete over Caleb's head. Sloane shifted to catch the same angle. Kira took in one more detail, noting there were no marker lights, no broad route, and no wasted movement. They were using the seam between surf noise and land shadow to pass something through coastal dead space without ever naming it on a manifest. The false casualty, the bag, the route shaping, all of it snapped tighter at once. Jax's breath stayed rough under her hand. He was alive, but no longer what he had been an hour ago. Kira felt that truth settle before she let herself name it. Whatever came next, his working edge was gone for now. Maybe longer. She adjusted her weight and felt the bleeding slow from spray to a thick, stubborn seep, which was good enough for movement, but not good enough for comfort. Caleb risked one more look over the broken edge, then stared at the dark water where the load was slipping through the gap. He did not need the picture explained anymore. Julian Cross had not been hurting them for sport. He had been clearing a lane. That's what this was for, Sloane said quietly. Kira kept pressure on Jax and watched one of the shadowed figures vanish behind the far break in the wall. There it was. Objective. It was not theory anymore, but something real already in motion. Jax gave another wet, hitching breath and tried to gather his legs under him. Kira pressed him back down with one bloody forearm. Not yet. The fire overhead thinned and shifted inland, as if the men on the flats no longer cared whether she saw them. That was the ugliest part. They were ahead of the team now, ahead of the route, maybe ahead of the night itself. Kira looked from the wound under her hand to the dark water where the load was moving, and understood the cost all at once. They had found the game, and Jax had paid for the answer. The bluff above the seawall had once held equipment worth guarding. Now it held only broken radar panels, snapped conduit, and a squat concrete service hut, with its door hanging crooked on one hinge. That was enough, providing enough elevation to watch the tidal lane, and enough dead angles for somebody patient to turn the place into a funnel. Kira lay behind a slab with one forearm locked over Jax's wound, feeling his breath stutter against her sleeve, while the rest of the team flattened into whatever cover the ruin was still willing to pretend to be. Fire came in measured bursts, not frantic and not probing anymore. It was controlled and professional. Rounds clipped the wall, shaved sparks from rebar, slapped the concrete lip over Caleb's head, then stopped just long enough to invite movement. The broken radar dish above them groaned in the wind like old metal remembering how to scream. Salt mist dragged across Kira's face and dried under the heat still burning in her muscles. Jax was alive. Barely. The package was moving. The shooters did not need a clean kill. They only needed the team obeying the obvious route, the obvious cover, and the obvious fear. That was when the whole pattern stopped feeling scattered and started feeling designed. She did not look for a grand revelation, because those were for people who had time to stand up straight. She looked for dependency, the false casualty at the pad, the staged rotor wash lie, the way the fire on the trail had carved choices instead of bodies. The clean route at the fork, the transfer below the seawall, hidden in surf noise and shadow. Julian Cross had not built one trap. He had built choreography. Make decent people respond the way trained people always responded, then lean on the response until it became a cage. Caleb shifted beside her, watching the bursts strike the same broken line of wall over and over. "They've got us pinned," he said. Kira shook her head once. "No, they've got us steered." That landed, and she felt it in the silence after. She studied the shattered structures again and found the one thing the shooters kept protecting without ever looking at it. It was a black junction box, bolted under the remains of the old radar platform, too low for legacy hardware, and too newly mounted for the ruin around it. A cable bundle fed inland, through cracked conduit, deep inside the housing. The faint, shielded pulse of an infrared LED blinked, a steady, arrogant heartbeat dictating the enemy's timing. If that box was pushing a false signal, a visual cue, or a timing relay, the geometry made sense. They did not need to own every angle. They only needed the angles everyone else trusted to stay stable. Another burst bit into the concrete 3 feet to her right. Chips peppered her neck, but she ignored them. "Service box under the platform," she said. Caleb leaned just far enough to catch it, then dropped back before the next strike. "You sure?" "No." Her voice stayed flat. "I'm sure enough." Sloane, huddled lower behind a cracked culvert ring, followed Kira's line of sight and gave the smallest nod. Kira shifted pressure on Jax just long enough to get her pistol clear, then checked the angle against the broken concrete edge, the swing of the wind, the sparking line of enemy fire, and the cable run disappearing into the structure. It was not a good shot, but a necessary one. "He wants us running the route," she said. "Break the angle." Caleb understood before she finished. He reached up, killed his radio with his thumb, and the dead silence in her headset hit harder than the gunfire had. There was no net, no procedure, and no permission. There were just hand signals now, just the job stripped to bone. Kira rose a fraction, fired once, and saw the round strike high, providing too much fragment and not enough break. The next burst from the dark came instantly, driving them flatter. They had adjusted. Cross had seen the threat. Good. That meant she had found the right nerve. She changed position by inches, using the wet concrete, the broken lip, and the blind spot the incoming fire had already cut for them. Jax gave one rough breath under her hand and stayed down. Caleb flashed 2 fingers to signal he was covering. Sloane shifted left, slapped a burst into the upper wall, not to kill, just to bend the enemy rhythm half a beat. That was the margin Kira needed. She came up again, lower this time. The sight picture uglier but cleaner where it counted, and sent the shot through the seam between mounting plate and housing. The box blew open in a spray of black plastic, glass fiber, and hot white sparks. Something inside popped twice, sharp as bones breaking, and the cable run jerked like a live thing before going dead. The effect came fast. The hidden lane below lost its disciplined darkness. One shielded light flared where it should have stayed blind, and another answered too late from farther inland. The burst pattern around them broke apart, not gone, just confused. Cross had lost the quiet alignment that made the whole trap breathe. "Move!" Caleb snapped. "Not on the radio. Not for the system. Just for them." He gave a hand signal, then motion. He grabbed the covered bag. Sloane took the next piece of ground, and Kira hauled Jax with her into the opening. The ruined geometry had finally given back. Behind them, the bluff spat a few last angry rounds into empty concrete. Ahead, the lane was no longer theirs to die in. By the time the rescue bird lifted off the new pickup point, the night had already spent everything worth spending. The cabin floor vibrated through steel, boots, bone, and the sore muscles across Kira's shoulders that had never really recovered from the corridor fight. Red cabin lights turned blood black and skin the color of old paper. Somebody had hosed the worst of the mud off before loading, but the helicopter still smelled like brine, cordite, hydraulic fluid, and the dense iron stink of blood worked into fabric. No one looked victorious. Caleb sat braced against the bulkhead, with a tablet on one knee and a pen in his fist, writing the first dry version of events while rotor noise erased any chance of small talk. Sloane leaned back with her head against the wall, her eyes closed but not asleep, one hand still wrapped around a torn glove she had never gotten rid of. Dr. Miller had his sleeves rolled and his face gone hollow with fatigue, the kind that made men older by the hour. Jax lay against Kira's leg under a thermal wrap, breathing shallow, alive, because alive was all the night had promised. The aircraft climbed through low cloud and the whole cabin shuddered once, hard, then steadied, into that relentless mechanical vibration that made exhaustion feel like another layer of weather. Adrenaline had gone, which was always the mean part. During the fight, the body kept its bargains. Afterward, it mailed the invoice. Kira could feel every place the night had collected from her, noting grit in the cuts along her cheek and bruising under the vest. Tendons in her right wrist were singing where the twisted leash had chewed into them, and the residue tightening across her fingers pulled each time she flexed them. Caleb never looked up from the report, but once he tore out a page, rewrote a line, and kept going without comment. That was close enough to respect in this line of work. It was not praise and not absolution, just accuracy revised in the direction of truth. Sloane opened her eyes long enough to check Jax, then Kira, then the floor, and said nothing. Good. There was nothing worth saying that would not cheapen the room. The team had made it out, and the package had not moved clean. Cross had lost the lane he built. All of that was real. So was the price sitting warm and unsteady against Kira's thigh. Jax tried once to lift his head. She put a hand on his neck and felt the effort drain back out of him. She offered no cooing and no pretty words. She gave just pressure and presence, the same currency they had always used with each other when the world got narrow. Her hand moved on its own after a while, following the old ritual because habits dug deeper than thought. Touch the front strap, check the ring, find the gate, confirm the close. The sequence had once taken less than a second, but tonight it broke under her fingers. The carabiner at Jax's chest was still there, but the metal had twisted in the corridor and taken another hit at the seawall. One side was flattened, and the spring gate no longer sat clean in the notch. When she pushed it shut, it caught, scraped, slipped, then refused the old easy lock. Kira stared at it for a beat too long. All the way back to the pad, the night had been full of lies, dressed like routine. But this wasn't one of them. This was plain. Something had changed and was not changing back. She worked the gate again, slower now, feeling burrs of damaged metal with the pad of her thumb, the way she had felt wound edges and false narratives and bad geometry all night long. Jax gave a low, rough breath but did not pull away. Caleb's pen stopped for half a second, not enough to turn into a scene, but just enough to mark that he had heard the metal fail to behave like metal should. Then the pen started moving again, showing quiet discipline, the same as ever, only truer now. On the third try, the gate seated as far as it was ever going to. It was not flush and not right, it just held. The sound it made was small, dry, and ugly as truth. It was a thin metal click under the hammering rotors. Almost nothing, except every person in the cabin heard it. Kira left her hand there a moment longer on the bent hardware and the wrapped heat of the dog beneath it. Outside the porthole, dawn was beginning somewhere behind the clouds, not visible yet, only lightening the black by degrees too mean to call mercy. No one offered congratulations, and no one reached for a joke to get them home softer. Caleb finished the line he was on, capped the pen, and set the report on his knee like another piece of gear that had survived because it had to. Kira looked at the twisted gate, at the dried blood in the seams of her knuckles, at the dog who had kept working until the night physically took the choice away from him. Then she said the only thing in the cabin that sounded honest enough to keep. If it's wrong, it's on me. Nobody argued, and nobody comforted her either. The helicopter kept shaking north through the dark, carrying the team, the wreckage, and that bent piece of metal that would never close clean again.